Amen. The book of Exodus, written by Moses, is very simple as far as the purpose of it. It is to show the exiting of the children of Israel out of Egyptian bondage. The word Exodus actually is a word that we get the word exit from. You see that sign up there? Exit. We get exit from the word Exodus. Exodus is actually a Greek word, and it means to depart or to leave. So it's very simply the fulfillment of what was given to Abraham concerning a prophecy about his descendants going down into Egypt, becoming a great multitude of people, and then being oppressed by Egypt, and as a result of that needing to be delivered, and God would judge that nation and deliver them out of Egyptian bondage, cause them to exit out of Egypt, and then go and establish themselves in the promised land. So that is the history that we're going to look at here as we get started. Give you a brief, simple outline of the book of Exodus to kind of get an overview of what we're going to be looking at. Exodus chapter 1, the need for redemption. Redemption here means being set free from slavery, being set free and inheriting the promises of the promised land. So chapter 1, the need for redemption. Chapters 2 through 4, preparation for redemption. 2 through 4, preparation for redemption. Chapters 5 through chapter 15, verse 21, the redemption of Israel. The redemption of Israel. Chapter 15 and verse 22 through chapter 18, the preservation of Israel. Preservation of Israel. Chapters 19 through 31, the revelation of the covenant to Israel. Revelation of the covenant to Israel, which included, as we studied in our series of Exodus chapter 20, the Ten Commandments given to Israel. And chapter 32 through 40, the response of Israel to the covenant. The response of Israel to the covenant. So that's what we're going to look at. We're going to begin with chapter 1. We're going to read a few verses. Then we're going to go into the book of Acts, and we'll explain that in just a moment why we're going to do that. Of course, this was written by Moses, inspired history, as he wrote, guided by the Spirit of God. Exodus 1 and verse 1. Now these are the names of the sons of Israel who came to Egypt with Jacob. They came each one with his household: Reuben, Simeon, Levi, Judah, Issachar, Zebulun, Benjamin, Dan, Naphtali, Gad, Asher. All the persons who came from the loins of Jacob were 70 in number. But Joseph was already in Egypt. We've already studied that in the latter part of the book of Genesis, that Joseph was already there and he rose to power, and through that preserved the family. Verse 6, Joseph died and all his brothers and all that generation. That closed out chapter 50 of Genesis. Verse 7, but the sons of Israel were fruitful and increased greatly and multiplied and became exceedingly mighty, so that the land was filled with them. So they grew into a mighty people, just as God predicted that would happen. Verse 8, now a new king arose over Egypt who did not know Joseph. He said to his people, behold, the people of the sons of Israel are more and mightier than we. Come, let us deal wisely with them, or else they will multiply, and in the event of war they will also join themselves to those who hate us and fight against us and depart from the land. Now what you have to understand during this period of time here is there was a shift in power. A new set of rulers came to power in Egypt. Before that, They were known as the Hyksos, not hot sauce, Hyksos rulers. A new set of rulers came in and overtook them there in Egypt. And so some new rulers came to power. And that's why it says that this new king, verse 8, this new Pharaoh, arose over Egypt who did not know Joseph. What they would do when they would go into a land is they would basically erase the history of the previous empire. And so any record of Joseph in any of the hieroglyphics or any of their writings would have been done away with, because they were the ones who were now in control, and they didn't want anyone to rob them of their glory, so they kind of just erased the knowledge and the history of the previous empire. The king, historians believe, was a pharaoh by the name of Amos of the 18th dynasty. And the reason why that's important is just it's history. This is historical. This actually happened. And those who are not even believers in the Bible understand that there was, and these events did actually take place, and as a result verify that the Bible is true. Let's look briefly at Acts chapter 7. The reason why we're going to look at Acts chapter 7 before we go any further is because the Bible gives us summations of Hebrew history. In Acts chapter 7, we have a summation of Hebrew history as Stephen is preaching to the Jewish leaders. And he is going to start with Abraham, and he's going to recount their history to them. And he's going to bring it all the way down. We're not going to read as far as he preached, but he's going to bring it all the way down to the time of Christ and say, you took Christ and you killed him. He was the one that was the fulfillment of all these promises. Look at Acts chapter 7, verse 1. Stephen is before the Sanhedrin. The high priest said to him, are these things so concerning the charges brought against him? Acts chapter 7 and verse 2. And he said, hear me, brethren and fathers. The glory of God, or the God of glory, appeared to our father Abraham when he was in Mesopotamia, before he lived in Haran. That's when he was called out of Ur of the Chaldees. Acts chapter 7 and verse 2. Abraham, when he was in Mesopotamia, so we know that Ur of the Chaldees was in the area of Mesopotamia. Before he lived in Haran, God appeared to him. Verse 3, and said to him, Acts chapter 7 and verse 3, leave your country and your relatives and come into a land that I will show you. We studied that when we looked at the Genesis chapter 12. That's exactly what God said to him. Acts 7 and verse 4. Then he left the land of the Chaldeans and settled in Haran. From there, after his father died, God had him move to the country in which you are now living. As Stephen is talking to the people who are in the promised land, he said, now you're living in the land that was promised to Abraham. Verse 5 of Acts chapter 7. But he gave him no inheritance in it, not even a foot of ground. Yet even when he had no child, he promised that he would give it to him as a possession and to his descendants after him. Remember, Abraham didn't own anything in the promised land except the burial plot. The cave where he buried his wife and the others were buried, where Jacob requested to be buried, as we studied earlier. So here we see that the promise was made to Abraham, Acts chapter 7 and verse 5, that his descendants would possess the land. Verse 6 of Acts 7. But God spoke to this effect, that his descendants would be aliens in a foreign land. This is the beginning of Exodus. And that they would be enslaved and mistreated for 400 years. Verse 7, and whatever nation to which they will be in bondage, I myself will judge. That's talking about what God told to Abraham, the prophecy that was made, that his descendants would be enslaved in a foreign land. And that's what we find in Exodus chapter 1. And that nation would be judged. And God said, after that, they will come out and serve me in this place. Verse 8, He gave him the covenant of circumcision, so Abraham became the father of Isaac, circumcised him on the 8th day, and Isaac became the father of Jacob, and Jacob the 12 patriarchs. That's the latter part of the book of Genesis. We studied that in detail as we looked at every chapter and verse concerning that. Look at verse 9 of Acts chapter 7. The patriarchs became jealous of Joseph and sold him into Egypt, yet God was with him. That's during that period of time that Joseph was at odds with his brothers, or his brothers at odds with him, and sold him into Egypt. Verse 10, rescued him from all his affliction. God was with him, rescued him from all his affliction, granted him favor and wisdom in the sight of Pharaoh, king of Egypt, and made him governor over Egypt and all his household. So that is the power that Joseph received after he interpreted those dreams. And so we read about that in the book of Genesis as well. Verse 11, now famine came over all of Egypt and the Canaan, and great affliction with it, and our fathers could not find food. But when Jacob heard that there was grain in Egypt, he sent our fathers there the first time. Verse 13, on the second visit, Joseph made himself known to his brothers, and Joseph's family was disclosed to Pharaoh. So Joseph, of course, made himself known to his brothers there. Verse 14. Then Joseph sent word and invited Jacob his father and all his relatives to come to him, 75 persons in all. Verse 15. And Jacob went down to Egypt, and there he and his father died. That's the end of the book of Genesis. From there they were removed to Shechem and laid in the tomb which Abraham had purchased with a sum of money from the sons of Haram and Shechem. Verse 17. But as the time of the promise was approaching, which God had assured to Abraham, the people increased and multiplied in Egypt. That's what we studied in Exodus chapter 1. Until there arose another king or Pharaoh over Egypt who knew nothing about Joseph. Verse 19, it was he who took the shrewd advantage of our race and mistreated our fathers so that they would expose their infants and they would not survive. So that brings us up to speed from Abraham all the way to the children of Israel in Egypt and being mistreated by the Egyptians, by this Pharaoh who did not recognize Joseph and the great good that he did. Now keep in mind how big of an insult this is. This is not only an insult to Israel, but this is an insult to Joseph himself, because if it were not for Joseph, Egypt would have perished in the famine. He saved Egypt. Well, God ultimately. But God, through Joseph, saved Egypt from the 7 years of famine. So this is, again, a rejection of Joseph's authority. Joseph is long dead by now. So what you're going to have here in Exodus chapter 1 is a form of population control. As they realize the people are growing into a great people, they're concerned about that. Exodus chapter 1 and verse 10. Come, let us deal wisely with them, or else they will multiply in the event of war. They will also join themselves to those who hate us and fight against us and depart from the land. So the concern there is, if we have enemies come in, these Israelites will join forces with them and overtake us. So we've got to do something about this. So they appointed taskmasters over them to afflict them with hard labor, brought them into slavery. And they built for Pharaoh storage cities, Pithom and Ramses. Verse 12. But the more they afflicted them, the more they multiplied, and the more they spread out, so that they were in dread of all the sons of Israel. So they started to enslave them and afflict them, but the more they afflicted them, the more they multiplied, so that wasn't working. The enslavement and the affliction brought upon them was not stifling the population. In fact, they were multiplying. Verse 13, the Egyptians compelled the sons of Israel to labor strenuously or rigorously, some translations might say. So it was hard labor that they were enduring. And it says in verse 14, and made their lives bitter with hard labor in mortar and brick, and at all kinds of labor in the field, and all their labors which they rigorously imposed upon them. So put hard labor upon the children of Israel during this period of time. And by doing this, this is setting the stage for the reason why that they're going to have to be delivered from them, because the Pharaoh is not going to let them go. He's got slaves. He's got a whole nation of slaves that can build cities for him. You wouldn't want to let that go if you were of the mindset of Pharaoh. So here we're setting the stage for the reason why they need a deliverer. But they kept multiplying, so that was a concern for them. Look at verse 15 of Exodus chapter 1. Then the king of Egypt spoke to the Hebrew midwives, one of whom was named Sephara, and the other was named Pua. Verse 16, and said, when you are helping the Hebrew women to give birth, see them upon the birth stool. If it is a son, then you shall put him to death. But if it is a daughter, then you shall let her live. Now the birthing stool there refers to the process by which they would give birth. It was almost a setting position that they would give birth. And the midwives who were in charge there, verse 15, of course, most likely there would have been a numerous midwives, but these were the ones kind of in charge of the midwives. See, it said, if you see a son born, you kill it. But if you see a daughter, let it live. Now, why would you want to kill off the sons and leave the daughters? Why not kill off all of them? Sons can grow up to be warriors. Sons can grow up to be warriors. Why leave the females? They can work for you. There's your servants. So you can stifle the population growth by killing off the men who would be a threat. They could grow up to be warriors, and still let the baby girls be born, because they'll grow up to be your slaves. So this was a way to still have the Israelites produce for them slaves, as far as females are concerned, but then kill off the men or the boys, because they would not grow up to be warriors and rebel. Verse 17 says the midwives feared God. And that's key, because it says it again in verse 21, they feared God. These midwives were evidently godly people who wanted to do what's right, and they knew that this type of operation was wrong. To kill innocent blood like this is murder. We're more sophisticated in our society. We do it before they're born. It's called abortion. They did it after the birth. We do it before the birth. I say we as a society. But it's still killing of innocent life. The killing of the unborn. Whether it be unborn or born, it's still shedding of innocent blood. But these midwives feared God. They respected God, and they were not going to be involved in this, and did not do as the king, verse 17, of Egypt had commanded them, but let the boys live. So the king of Egypt called the midwives and said to them, why have you done this thing, and let the boys live? Verse 19, the midwives said to Pharaoh, because the Hebrew women are not as the Egyptian women, for they are vigorous and give birth before the midwife can get to them. So they're giving birth so quick, we can't get there and make the decision and do away with them. Now, whether that was true or not, whether that was a lie or not, some have speculated that this may have been something that was untrue, that the midwives said, or it could have been a truth. Verse 20, so God was good to the midwives, and the people multiplied and became very mighty. So they kept growing in population, and God was good to them, notice, because the women feared, respected God. And because they had a fear and respect for God, they were going to do what's right. The Pharaoh could have easily had them put to death for disobeying his order, but they were going to do what's right because they respected God above all. And there's a principle there of putting God first above all. Verse 21, because the midwives feared God, he established households for them. So there you see, again, it's mentioned as Moses is writing this, that they feared God, and because of this response to God, he established households for them. Verse 22, then Pharaoh commanded all the people, saying, every son who is born you are to cast into the Nile, and every daughter you are to keep alive. So the order goes out, commands his people concerning this. You cast the son born to you into the Nile, and then every daughter you keep alive. Any question or comment about chapter 1 before we get into chapter 2? We're seeing now the affliction of an ungodly Pharaoh, an ungodly empire upon Israel. Just a few generations earlier, it was a Hebrew that saved not only Israel, but Egypt from the famine. My, how things change over a few years. How that people are not grateful for what was done in the past concerning helping their own people and helping those who were in Egypt, and they are now enslaving them. It's the greed of man to do something like this. Look at Exodus chapter 2. We're going to have the birth of Moses here. Now a man from the house of Levi went and married a daughter of Levi. Now that's important because Moses' brother is Aaron of the tribe of Levi. And we're going to be told later on the priests are to come from Levi. Verse 2, the woman conceived and bore a son, and when she saw that he was beautiful, she hid him for 3 months. Notice this, I pointed this out before, conceived and bore a son. Conception is always the beginning of human life. In the Scripture, that's how it is. Conception starts human life, and then the birth takes place. God considers that which is in the womb to be human life. And she bore a son. He was beautiful, a beautiful child, and so she hid him for 3 months because of Pharaoh's order. Verse 3, but when she could hide him no longer, she got him a wicker basket and covered it over with pitch and tar. Then she put the child into it and set it among the reeds of the bank of the Nile. This word basket is the same word. I think it's only used one other time in the Old Testament in the Hebrew for ark. It's the word for ark. Well, of course, this is not near as big as Noah's ark, but it's still an ark. It is a floating vessel for one baby. So I think this is the only other time that this word in Hebrew is used to describe a floating vessel like this, and it's the word for ark. And covered it all around with tar and pitch. Why would she do that? Make it waterproof. You don't want it to sink. To make it waterproof. Isn't that what God told Noah to do? And isn't that what Noah did with the ark? So it would be waterproof. Put the child into the Nile. Now here's something that's interesting. She's partially obeying the command, but she's giving the child a way to survive. She's not just throwing the baby in to die. She's putting the baby in the Nile in a containment of safety, in a basket. So it's going in the Nile, but not according to the Pharaoh's wishes. His sister stood at a distance to find out what would happen to him. So, of course, going down the Nile here, during the current of it would take it along. Verse 5, and the daughter of Pharaoh came down to bathe at the Nile, with her maidens walking alongside the Nile, and she saw the basket among the reeds, and sent her maid, and she brought it to her. Verse 6, she opened it, and she saw the child. Behold, the boy was crying, And she had pity on him and said, "This is one of the Hebrews' children." So she sees this child in this basket, and she sees the child crying and recognizes it as one of the Hebrews' children. Verse 7, then his sister said to Pharaoh's daughter, "Shall I go and call a nurse for you from the Hebrew women, that she may nurse the child for you?" Verse 8, Pharaoh's daughter said to her, "Go ahead." So the girl went and called the child's mother. So Moses' own mother will be the one to nurse this child. Are we seeing the providence of God here? Not one mention of a miracle. Not one mention of anything supernatural. It's providence. And all of these events are happening naturally, the natural flow of the Nile, but God is manipulating the things that are going on. No miracles. Nothing of that nature. But it's God, like He did with Joseph, manipulating the circumstances so that he would be in Pharaoh's household. That's what providence is. Providence is happening today. It happens in the life of God's people. We understand from the Scriptures there's no modern day revelation, therefore there's no miracles and signs and wonders going on, but providence is happening. Look at verse 9. Then Pharaoh's daughter said to her, "Take this child away and nurse him for me, and I will give you your wages." So the woman took the child and nursed him. So his own mother is nursing him and now getting paid for it. Pretty good deal. Getting paid for it. Verse 10, the child grew and she brought him to Pharaoh's daughter and he became her son. So at some point the child grew and he became adopted into Pharaoh's household. Verse 10, and she named him Moses and said, "Because I drew him out of the water." That word Moses there is a word that's very similar to the Hebrew word to draw out. The word Moses, Moshiach, I think it's how it's pronounced, is very similar to the Hebrew word Masha, which means to draw out. So it's a play on words there. Moses' name means to be drawn out. Well, he was drawn out of the Nile River. So that's his name. Verse 11, now it came about in those days when Moses had grown up, that he went out to his brethren and looked on their hard labors, and he saw an Egyptian beating a Hebrew, one of his brethren. When you look at verse 11 there, you have a lot of time passing. And according to Acts chapter 7 and verse 23, 40 years had passed. He's at 40 years old at this point when you get to Exodus chapter 2 and verse 11. He grew up. He wanted to know about his people, the Hebrew people. So he went out and he saw an Egyptian beating a Hebrew, one of his brethren. Verse 12, so he looked this way and that, and when he saw that there was no one around, he struck down the Egyptian and hid him in the sand. So he killed him. He killed this Egyptian and then hid his body in the sand. He went out the next day, and behold, two Hebrews were fighting with each other, and he said to one another, he said, "Why are you striking your companion?" Verse 14. But he said, "Who are you, or who made you a prince or a judge over us? Are you intending to kill me as you killed the Egyptian?" Then Moses was afraid and said, "Surely this matter has become known." In killing that Egyptian, he wanted to try to cover it up. And when he saw the two Hebrews fighting with one another, he said, "Why are you doing this? Why are you striking your companion?" And one of them said to him, "Who made you a prince or a judge over us?" The interesting thing about that is, he would be a judge and a prince over Israel. Not at this time. It's going to be another 40 years before that takes place. Remember, he's 40 years old when this is happening. it's going to be another 40 years before he is called to be the deliverer of Israel. He's going to be in his 80s. The movies and the animated movies that show Moses as a guy about 40 years old to deliver the people is just not accurate. He was in his 80s when he was called to be the deliverer of Egypt, or of Israel from Egypt. So in verse 14, he's concerned about the situation because now the matter is known that he had killed this Egyptian. In verse 15, when Pharaoh heard of this matter, he tried to kill Moses. So we know now that this Pharaoh, whoever this Pharaoh might have been, some believe it was the Pharaoh Thutmose III. No one knows for sure. But this Pharaoh wanted Moses to be put to death for what he had done in killing that Egyptian. But Moses fled from the presence of Pharaoh and settled in the land of Midian, and he sat down by a well. Midian is a place that is named after one of Abraham's descendants. The Midianites come from Abraham. So he is there in a region that his ancestor Abraham was really the founder of, so to speak, as the Midianites come from Abraham. Now he is cast out, so to speak, of Egypt. He is now in exile, running from the Pharaoh. Verse 16, now the priest of Midian had 7 daughters, and they came to draw water and filled the troughs to water their father's flocks. There's a priest of Midian. Now keep that in mind as we go on down. He had 7 daughters. They came to the well to draw out water for the flock. Verse 17, the shepherds came and drove them away, but Moses stood up and helped them and watered their flock. So you would have these shepherds come and kind of bully the women, but Moses stood up for them and allowed them to water their flock. Verse 18, when they came to Reuel, their father, he said, why have you come back so soon? And they said, an Egyptian delivered us from the hand of the shepherds, and what is more, he even drew the water for us and watered the flock. So even right here at this point, Moses is defending the helpless. This is foreshadowing. He did it with an individual back in Egypt when the Egyptian was going after one of his fellow Hebrew. He killed that Egyptian and hid his body in the sand. He was acting as a deliverer, had that characteristic of a deliverer. Now you have the 7 daughters of Reuel there, and the shepherds are there bullying them, and he's delivering them from these shepherds so they could water their flocks. He has that characteristic of a deliverer, even at this point. Verse 20, he said to his daughters, where is he then? Why is it that you have left the man behind? Invite him to have something to eat. Verse 21, Moses was willing to dwell with the man, and he gave his daughter Zipporah to Moses. This Reuel is also known as Jethro. Jethro, another name for Reuel. He is a priest of Midian. As we will come across this a little bit later on when we get into the book of Exodus, it seems as though he is a priest of God, not an idolatrous priest. Remember how Abraham came across a priest of God? We studied about him last week. Melchizedek. So here and there in the ancient world, there were still people who were loyal to the one true God, and here Moses is coming across a priest of Midian who would become his father-in-law as he marries Zipporah, his daughter. Verse 22, then she gave birth to a son, and he named him Gershom, for he says, I have been a sojourner in a foreign land. Gershom is Hebrew for a stranger. So that name represents his sojourning. He had left the palaces and the riches and the wealth of Egypt, and now he is a foreigner and a stranger in a foreign land. Verse 23, now it came about in the course of those days that the king of Egypt died. This Pharaoh died. And the sons of Israel sighed because of their bondage, and they cried out, and their cry for help because of their bondage rose up to God. Verse 24, so God heard their groaning, and God remembered his covenant with Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. God saw the sons of Israel, and God took notice of them. Verse 24, it says God remembered his covenant. Does that mean he forgot about it? He said, oh, wait a minute. They're in bondage now. I need to help them out. That remembered there doesn't mean he forgot and he saw them suffering and remembered. That meant he is going to honor that covenant that he made with Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob to deliver them. But all in good time. There is a time frame that God works in, and it's not always according to the way man thinks God should work or how fast God should work. And here you have the children of Israel suffering, and what did Stephen say? For 400 years. That's a long time. And just think of our nation. Our nation is a little over 200 years old. For 400 years, that suffering and that affliction going on, and God is seeing that. But He's waiting for the right moment, for the right person. And Moses is that right person. Because we already see the characteristics in chapter 2 is he has that characteristic of wanting to wrong rights. Or right wrongs. Sorry, got that backwards. He's wanting to right wrongs as he sees people being mistreated. He wants to deliver them. Well, he's going to be used. But during this period of time, when you get from chapter 2 to chapter 3, there's going to be another 40 years pass. He's got to spend another 40 years in the wilderness to cultivate some skills to help him be a good leader. And even then, when he's called by God, he starts making excuses. He wasn't a perfect man. He starts making the excuses. He can't do this. I'm not a good speaker. Get somebody else. And God actually kind of gets angry with him. We'll see that in chapter 3. So we see here we're setting the stage for, we saw in chapter 1 why they needed to be delivered. We saw the birth in chapter 2 of the deliverer and why he is in exile and how that he will meet up with a manifestation of God who is going to call him in Exodus chapter 3 to be the deliverer of Israel. Next week we'll have singing, but after that we will take up our study in Exodus.